Okay, it's probably a good idea if people put themselves on mute so that you don't get distracted by random noises. I've been distracted during lecture by cats and dogs and postmen and phones and who knows what. So, okay, I will find my share screen button. So, first of all, welcome virtually to South Wales. It's a cold and windy night here, and you might hear the wind howling round outside, but it just it adds a bit of atmosphere to the whole proceedings. You can imagine you're in a wild and remote cottage in Clintyfinnan a couple of 100 years ago. So I'll just put the full screen on. Okay, people should be able to see the whole screen with Andy Eileen's picture of over Clintyfinnan that adorns the front of the book. So, so nice view. So what the talk's going to do is it's not really going to focus on the present day really, and the 20th century. It's going to look a little bit further back and picks out a few characters to look at from the past, and it shows you how we've gone about conducting some of the research, how we found some of the information, some of the leads we've followed, from sometimes very scant information, and what we've been able to glean from the various records. So, first of all, those who don't know me, and I'm aware a lot of people on the talk tonight do know me, but I grew up in Ballymoney, and I was regularly out with my father on my grandfather James Kerr's farm. It was just across the river from the River Bush from Clintyfinnan. Here's a picture taken in the 1980s, and I think Clintyfinnan is just slightly over here. So we moved to the farm after Granny and Granda moved out in 1984, and in 1986 I left home to go to St Andrews University, and well, I haven't lived back there since. So after a PhD, more research into volcanic geology, because I did research and started to work on the same type of rocks that I grew up on. For the last 20 years, I've been a lecturer in Cardiff University. So where did this all start? Well, me being interested in family history started in the summer of 1986 after I did my A-levels before going to university. I started, as I say, to get interested. So I talked to a few relatives, didn't get in too seriously, went around a few of the local churches, Culrat's Reformed Presbyterian, Bushvale, and Armoy Presbyterian graveyards, made a few notes, but never really took it very much further. Life got in the way. For 20 years, I went to university and just slipped to the back of my mind, the way that things very often tend to do. In the meantime, Aunt Dorothy had started to compile family history of another branch of our family, the McQuestons of Friary, near Lochiel, and this was printed in 2012. And I was involved in the latter stages of that to a little extent, but wasn't really involved in it at all. But this renewed my interest in the whole Kerr family stories. I dug out my old notes and things and started to look at things, and I started to encourage Dorothy to put together a similar book for the Kerrs of Clintyfinnan. And so this is where it was born. And 10 years later, we're sitting here and the book is published. So for those of you who don't know, just a little explanation to where Clintyfinnan is, so we can focus ourselves. So this is obviously Northern Ireland, and this is where the enlarged map sort of expands into. The main local town is Ballymoney, into also Ballycastle out here. But you're not too far from the north coast, and there's actually two townlands called Clintyfinnan. There's Clintyfinnan West, Clintyfinnan East. Now, most of the Kerrs and through history have lived in Clintyfinnan West. I know that I think Barbara lives in Clintyfinnan East, but most of the action, as it were, in this talk centres on the Clintyfinnan West. So it straddles the River Bush. The River Bush runs through here. And this is a map from the book, and it's got what it's got marked on it is all the townlands that are mentioned in the book. Now, for those of you who don't know, townlands are the sort of the smallest division of land you can get in Ireland, and it's quite good when you're a family historian or a genealogist trying to work out things, because it really ties people down to, maybe 10, 20 farms that were comprised these townlands. So I've included this map in the book so that people can get some kind of idea as to where the various townlands are. And this is where Clintyfinnan is here. So as you go through the book, you'll see references to these various townlands. So where does that name come from, Clintyfinnan? It's quite an odd name, really. Well, it's from what I can find, the name's spelt in a variety of ways. The earliest historical mention of the name goes back to 1333 when it was spelt Clantfinnan, and then there's various spellings of the name through time. A lot of this would have been, the way people heard it, they wrote it down. There's two possible Gaelic or Irish interpretations of the name. I'm not really going to try and pronounce it because I am not a linguist, but that Clyntyfionan, I'm sure that's not the way you say it. But it means, it can mean one of two things, either the meadows of the coarse mountain grass, or the meadows of Finnan, a person. Who Finnan was and how long ago he lived, if he even did live, if he was just a mythical character, I don't know. But that's the origin of the name. So within the last couple of hundred years, the name's been spelt variously, usually changing the third letter. The most common spellings with an I, an O, or a U, but I've seen it also spelt with an A or an E. And as if to add to the confusion, the Clintyfinnan Road today has got one spelling at one end of the road on the sign, and the other end of the road's got a different spelling. So this is actually true for a lot of the townlands in Ireland. It can be quite tricky to find your way about sometimes. So let's go way back. Where does the whole clan, the Kerr clan, come from? Well, one story, this one that I tend to buy into, is that it comes from the Old Norse name. So it's a Viking name, really. KJ Kerr, however way you pronounce that in Scandinavian, and it means men from the marshes, men from the boggy, people that lived in boggy ground. The Kerrs can be traced back, at least certain branches of the family, to the Viking invasion of Normandy, about 900 AD. And they came over with William the Conqueror in 1066. They fought in the Battle of Hastings, and for their help in the Battle of Hastings, they were given lands in Lancashire. And the Clan Kerr in Scotland, this is an old clan map of Scotland. This is where the Kerr lands, where Finneyhurst Castle and Creesloch Castle are. But this is where the Kerr's lands were. This is where the Kerr territory, they were one of the Reaver clans. And in the 16th and 17th century, this was a pretty lawless area, one of the most lawless areas in the country. But anyway, the Clan Kerr descends from, I believe, a couple of brothers, Ralph and John Kerr, who settled in Jedburgh on the Scottish borders about 1330. And the Kerrs apparently became known as the Angry Kerrs, because they were apparently always more likely to settle their affairs by fighting rather than by negotiation. So, but let's hope that's been bred out of us and there's no fighting tonight. So one thing about the Kerr clan is, and it's well documented, in historical records, they trained their sons to use their swords with their left hands, and this gave them an advantage in battle. That's down the bottom here. This is Finneyhurst Castle. This is the the clan seat at the present day. But they also built their castles with anti-clockwise spiral staircases, which gave an advantage to the left-handed Kerrs. And this was famed in poetry and the lore. The Scottish poet James Hogg wrote a poem called "The Raid of the Kerrs," and this was one of the lines in it. But the Kerrs were aye the deadliest foes, that e'er to Englishmen were known, for they were all bred left-handed men, fence against them there was none. So it's also in a few other poems as well, which are a bit more gory, shall we say. But that was one of the more sanitized poems that was written. So where does the name come from? The motto. Many will be aware that the motto of the Kerr clan is late but in earnest. Cero sed serio, if I'm pronouncing my Latin right. I'm sure Aileen will tell me if I'm not. This was earned, this motto, at the Battle of Ancram Moor in King Henry VIII's time. It was one of the wars that Scotland fought with the English. The English hired mercenaries, and this was the Kerrs, wanted to make a penny or two, hired themselves out as mercenaries to the English as cavalrymen. And just Ancram Moor is where it is at the present day. This is what it looks like. This is where it is. So the English apparently initially held the Kerrs back, and they were going to send them in later in the battle when a weak spot developed. But a weak spot never developed, and the Kerrs last minute changed sides. Suppose they already had their cash, their bag of coins or whatever they got for being mercenaries, and they decided that maybe they'd be better fighting with the Scottish rather than the English. So in all the noise and confusion, apparently no one stopped to ask where all the extra Scots came from. So they earned this motto, late but in earnest. So they were late to the battle, but when they got there, they fought in earnest. So migration to Ireland, and this is where we come into the it comes closer to home. It's all very unclear, but what we can work out is that a chap called, in the mid 1600s, a chap called Paul Canning from Warwickshire acquired the townland of Garva, and he brought some settlers with him from the Scottish lowlands. And according to Dr. John Kerr from Garva, I don't know if John's here tonight, he was going to come. The ancestors of the Clontarf Kerrs were part of this group of settlers. Some of these Kerrs, or perhaps their children, we don't know, they moved to Clontarf, possibly in the late 1600s. Some stayed in Garva. There's still a contingent of Kerrs around Garva, which John Kerr is a part. So John Kerr is probably my 9th or 10th cousin, if you sort of assume 30 years every generation. You can take it back that far. Amazingly, this can be tracked with DNA. John Kerr recently had his DNA analysed, and we do share, him and my father. My father and I share a match with John Kerr on 2 segments of DNA. You need to worry about what it is, but it's just significant that we can track this connection between the families way back. Mm-hmm. There's another form of DNA which I have had analysed, and it's called Y-DNA. It's able to be tracked back a bit further. We'll get into the details of it because I don't fully understand the details. But one of my closest matches in this is a William Kerr, and he lives in the US somewhere. And his earliest known ancestors were from Virginia. He knows that his ancestors left Ireland sometime in the early 1700s, but he's not sure. He wasn't sure where until he got the DNA match with me. Now, the thing about Y-DNA is it's much more resilient in people's DNA. Well, it's passed down in male DNA, so it traces a family name through time. And it can pass down relatively unchanged for hundreds of years. So unlike the regular DNA that people analyze, this is specific to the male line, and it is a lot more resilient. So it's a very close match with him. So he was quite pleased to get this match with me because, my lines can be traced back to, Ireland since till 1650. So he was quite pleased because it probably revealed to him that where his ancestors most likely came from in Northern Ireland was probably from Garva. So the closeness of the Y-DNA match indicates that we may well share a common ancestor, maybe one of the original Garva Kerrs or one of their sons. Now, those of you who know a bit about migration from the Northern Ireland to the North American colonies will know that there was a contingent of 5 ships, famous migration left sort of from the Bann Valley about in 1718, quite a famous migration, largely of Presbyterians. Given the closeness of Garva to Akidui in the Bann Valley, I would suspect that there were some Kerrs from Garva part of this famous 1718 migration. The names of the people who migrated at that time are very scant. There were no ship manifests kept and things like that. So it's so this is sort of give you an indication of the distance between Garva and Clentyfinnon. So it's not all that far, maybe 15, 20 miles, something like that. So some of the Kerrs of the children, as we said, moved to Clentyfinnon probably in the late 1600s. And this, one of the earliest written documents is the 1803 agricultural census, which was done in Ireland. And there's 8 male Kerrs listed as tenants in Clentyfinnon at this time. So by 1800, there was enough Kerrs in the vicinity of Clentyfinnon to enable it to, there to be 8 male Kerrs. So these were people these would have been landholders, whether even a field or two or whatever. And there got to be so many Kerrs that the Clentyfinnon Road was known locally to previous generations, as it says in the book, as a Carston Road, hence the title of the book. But that's not the earliest record of Kerr, written record of Kerr presence at Clentyfinnon. The earliest one, and this was discovered by a friend of mine, Kate Connolly, who was actually at school with Eileen. She was digging around in the Register of Deeds, which is housed in a library in Dublin, but a lot has been put online recently. And she's an avid genealogist and was looking at this, and she forwarded this to me because she knows I'm working on Clentyfinnon Kerrs. And what this is a memorial of a deed of mortgage, and it's quite difficult to decipher in places. But basically, it's dated the 1st of May, 1718. And what it records, the acquisition of land at Clentyfinnon, which we assume is Clentyfinnon we know, by David Kerr, of probably of Ballymena is probably what the name is transcribed as, and his apprentice, which probably John Kerr, which is probably his son. And they acquired this land from somebody called Hugh Boyd. This is the earliest written record of a Kerr presence at Clentyfinnon. And it's my suspicion that David and John decided to move to Clentyfinnon probably because some of their kin were already there. And I suspect they were not the original Kerrs who moved to Clentyfinnon, but they may well have moved to the area because there were people who were maybe distantly related to them there. How they connect to the later Kerrs, we just don't know. Another early record is given by a headstone, which is in Derrykeegan churchyard. And Derrykeegan's a few miles from Clentyfinnon. We'll point it out in a later map. But this is, I haven't actually been to see this. I don't think you can read very much from the headstone, but this is from Dorothy Arthur's, one of Dorothy Arthur's old graveyard books, which are an amazing resource on old graveyards in North Antrim. But the inscription reads, "Here lieth the body of James Kerr," and this is an old spelling of the name Kerr of Clentyfinnon, who departed this life the 6th of May, 1735, aged 60 years. So this, until I recently discovered the deed of record, the register, well, the mortgage record from 1718. This was the previous earliest known record. Now, in the late 1600s, the earliest, the nearest Presbyterian meeting house to Clentyfinnon was Dervock, and it was known as Derry Keegan. And as we'll return to in a minute or two, the Kerrs likely attended there when they first arrived in the district. And this is likely why James Kerr was buried in Derry Keegan. It's a Church of Ireland graveyard. However, it's important to realise that at the time, non-Church of Ireland congregations were not permitted to have their own graveyards in the 1700s, or I'm not sure when that came in that they were allowed their own graveyards. But this is why they were buried in. He was buried in the Church of Ireland graveyard. So during as we said, during the 18th and 19th centuries, as many as 8 Kerr families resided at Clentyfinnon. By the time we got to the 20th century, only 2 families remained at Caresbrook and Springfield. And this is so this map is it's in the book. And yesterday afternoon I decided to colour this map up. It's not coloured in the book, but I decided to colour it up for the purposes of this, and I think it works quite well coloured up. So this is what this is. This is from the Griffiths valuation, which was a taxation valuation in Ireland. Happened between 1850 and 1865. But around Clentyfinnon and North Antrim, the valuation happened in 1860. So this is what the situation was like, Clentyfinnon around 1860. So you've got 5 different Kerrs owning land. Now, this is the Caresbrook land. This is John Kerr, who's part of the connection that we're able to trace. This is Thomas Kerr's land, which many of us here tonight are descended from. But then there was other Kerrs, and we cannot make the connection to how these Kerrs are related to the Springfield and Caresbrook Kerrs. A couple of other interesting things with this. Although the Caresbrook farm and the Springfield farm are fairly, the contiguous pieces of land. This James Kerr, his land is scattered a field here, a few fields there, all over the place, as is the Samuel Kerr's land dotted about. And this is probably just reflects the nature of the way land was passed down. Of course, it's important to point out that they didn't own this land. None of this land was owned. This was all leased at this time. We'll come on to when they bought the land from the landlords later. At this time, 1860, the land was leased to them. They were tenant farmers by James Adams. He owned all the land around this region. So this is Caresbrook, no longer occupied by Kerrs, but the name is still there. If you take a drive up Clentyfinnon Road, and this is my daughter a few years ago at Caresbrook, posing for a photograph. So the Caresbrook was the original family home of our branch of the Kerr family. The Springfield home was established by James Kerr, probably about 1810, something like that. And on land was originally part of the Caresbrook property, and we'll return to that more in a minute or two. But a little bit more on the places of worship of the Clentyfinnon Kerrs, because I think it's important to realise that when the Scottish settlers arrived in North Antrim, there was a lot fewer Presbyterian churches than there are now. The Kerr family is rooted in Scottish Presbyterianism, but in the late 1600s, there were only 4 Presbyterian churches in the area. One at Bushmills, which is known then as Billy, one at Ramone, out in the direction of Ballycastle, Dervock, which was known as Derry Keegan, hence, and this is where the old churchyard is, where James Kerr in 1735 is buried, and there was one in Ballymoney as well. Now, if you look where Clintyfinnon is, the nearest Presbyterian church to there would have been the Dervock or Derry Keegan one. So it's probably likely that the Clintyfinnon Kerrs attended there when they first arrived, given that they wouldn't have been able to travel as readily as we can these days. And of course, this is supported by the burial of James Kerr in Derry Keegan Church of Ireland graveyard. Then, moving forward in time, the next sort of batch of Presbyterian churches to open, Kilrat's was one of the more recent ones to, not more recent, but one of the, after the four original ones, Kilrat's was quite an early one to open as well. And given that Kilrat's is reasonably close to Clintyfinnon, and given that some Clintyfinnon Kerrs are buried in Old Kilrat's churchyard, which is actually just beside the present day Reformed Presbyterian Church, the likelihood is that the Kerr families at some point also attended Kilrat's Presbyterian Church, probably when it opened, because we wouldn't have to go as far, because it's only 3.5 miles from Clintyfinnon as opposed to the 6 miles that Derry Keegan was. Then in 1771, Presbyterian Church opened in Armoy, and this was just down the road from Clintyfinnon. It's only 2.5 miles, and most of the Clintyfinnon Kerrs were members there until about the mid-1800s. And then in the late 18th century, mid to late 18th century, both the Caresbrook and Springfield Kerrs left Armoy Presbyterian Church for whatever reason. We don't know. They seem to leave about the same time. The Springfield Kerrs went to Kilrat's Reformed Presbyterian Church, and the Caresbrook Kerrs started to attend Bushvale, or as it was known then, Second Kilrat's. So, this is a very brief family tree showing the Caresbrook and Springfield Kerrs and where they diverge. The common ancestor will probably have been born about 1760, 1750, something like that. He may have been called Thomas, he may have been called John. It's difficult to know. But one thing to notice is this naming convention, which makes its way through both families. On the Caresbrook Kerrs, you've got Robert Kerr, whose son was John Kerr, Robert Kerr, John Kerr. And on the Springfield side, you've got James Kerr, Thomas, James, Thomas. And this is very common. This is part of the Scottish-Irish naming tradition. And, where the first son was usually named after the grandfather. And there was a naming convention. The second son was named after the brother. The first daughter was named after the mother's mother. And it can be quite useful when you're a genealogist. So we'll have a little look at some of these characters on here. Just to say that one of the earliest printed records of the only printed record we have of Robert Kerr is this from the Coleraine Chronicle, a notice of his death in 1848. He died of something called mortification, which we think was probably gangrene. And then we got James Kerr over here. We know photographs of James Kerr. I cannot track when he died, but he was still alive in 1867 because this is his signature. His daughter died when she was in her 20s, and he signed the death record. At least I'm fairly sure it's him. This is his signature. That's the only sort of tangible, physical record we have of him. To say we don't have a photograph. Likewise, we don't unfortunately have a photograph of Thomas Kerr, although I'm sure that one must exist somewhere. But what we'll do is we'll go through a few of these. First of all, we'll start with James Kerr, the first Springfield Kerr, established the Springfield family home. So James Kerr has established the Springfield family home about 1810 or so. And this was after he married Mary Murphy, who was a Catholic. Fairly sure she didn't remain a Catholic after she married him. But this, you can imagine, over 200 years ago in Ireland would not have gone down well. It didn't go down well. It appears to be frowned upon by the family, even though she, became a Protestant, because he appears to have been given or acquired a poorer piece of land than the, across the road in a more mossy area. The census of Ireland, going forward to 1911, sort of confirms the preeminence of the Carisbrooke Kerrs in terms of property and financial prosperity. And this, I should say, is Carisbrooke at the present day, looking up towards the lane towards Carisbrooke. Springfield in the 1911 census is described as having a thatched roof with 2 to 4 rooms, a couple of windows at the front, 23 acres, whereas Carisbrooke is it's put in the category of house that has a slate roof, 10 to 12 rooms, 5 windows at the front, and 97 acres. So that just brings out that point. Now, to turn to some interesting characters on the Carisbrooke side, we'll take a look at Robert Kerr and Hamill Kerr. They didn't stay around Clentyfinnan. Robert Kerr immigrated to Australia in 1841. And he sailed, I discovered the ship that he sailed on. It was quite, unusual to find this information. It was in the New South Wales State Archives. The ship Manifest was there. He sailed on this. You can read what the boat was like: a 3-mast square rigged ship, black birch, oak and tarmac. And this ship sailed from Greenock, and it took over 4 months to get to Australia. That's a long journey. He arrived in Melbourne in January 1842, and you can see this is a copy of the record of was written of his boarding. So there were on this ship, there were 365 what they call bounty immigrants, and we'll talk a little bit in the next slide about what a bounty immigrant was. And unfortunately, there were 18 deaths during the whole voyage. But this was just 7 years after Melbourne was founded. So he was one of the very early settlers in Melbourne. So a little bit of these bounty immigrants. Bounty immigrants were free immigrants, so it wasn't, we've all heard of the convicts being transported to Australia, but the bounty immigrants were, in the early days, were sent out, were free immigrants whose passage was paid for by the colonial government under what they called a bounty scheme. And this was, you had these agents in Britain who recruited young, healthy male and females to, labourers and people who could work to build up the new colony. And everybody they recruited who arrived, alive and healthy, they were paid. These agents were paid a bounty, and the typical bounty was £19 for an adult or £5 for a child, and it would say for the safe and healthy arrival of the immigrants. Newly married couples, single men and women were given preference. This is an example of an advert from the time of one of these, trips to or immigration journeys to Australia. Then a few years later, his brother Hamill decided to go out and join him, and 1846 he went, but he returned to Ireland to marry Margaret Reynolds from near Strelocum, so it's just a few miles away, and they got married in Clonculloch or Dervock Presbyterian Church in 1854. So he traveled a long way back to marry her, and then they went back following the marriage. He and his wife sailed back to Australia in 1855. And he ran a wholesale grocery business with his brother in Melbourne. And that's just a notice of his death there. And a colonist of 54 years. And you will see a little bit more about the house he had, or in a minute or two. But they ran this wholesale grocery business, which was located in Collins Street in the centre of Melbourne. And those of you who've been to Melbourne, I haven't been, but Collins Street today is right in the heart of the central business district of Melbourne. But this is what it looked like, the bottom image here in 1851. So anyway, this business partnership went awry. I think they went bankrupt in 1861. And then we discovered this little clipping commending Robert's integrity. He paid off all the liabilities of the business. And I'll read it out. It's a bit long, but I'll read it out. It says, and it's written in the language of the time, it's our pleasing duty to notice an act of commercial integrity on the part of an old trader in our community, such as it has been seldom been in our power to record. Some 8 years ago, the firm of Messrs. R. and H. Kerr, wholesale grocers in Collins Street, were compelled to place their affairs in the hands of their creditors and ask for their forbearance. Since then, Mr. R. Kerr, the only representative of the firm, has been enabled to accumulate his present business as a land agent in amounts sufficient to pay off all the liabilities in question, amounting to £2,800 or £3,000. The several creditors in the state were accordingly surprised to find cheques for the various amounts due sent yesterday and the day before to their places of business, with the request that the same should be credited. It may well be supposed that an act which affects so favourably on Mr. Kerr has been the subject of conversation in commercial circles and has met with general approbation. So many years later, several years later, he came back and paid off all his debts. So they were a noble bunch. Mm-hmm. A little bit more on Hamill Kerr. Hamill, after the business went awry, returned to his roots, and he went out to the east of Melbourne and bought a farm, a couple of 100 acres, at a place called Nair Warren, and he farmed there until his death. The house he built was known as Aura, which I think is Irish for pleasant view or something. Someone will correct me if I'm wrong. But Hamill's descendants lived there until the 1940s. The house is now gone, but there's a park there these days called Kerr's Park. I don't know if you can see it. I took this off Street View, and it's not very clear, but I think you can just about see Kerr's Park. And this is in his memory, and his son, who was an eminent local councillor. So a little bit about some of James Kerr's children. The first one of these is Mary Kerr. I'm not going to say too much about it, but it's just in here for as an example of something quite unusual which happened. So Mary Kerr, James's daughter of 1827, she was born. She married William Gillen from near Armoy, so not too far away. In Armoy Presbyterian Church, she married him. And one of their 7 children, Mary Gillen, married James McCluskey from Armoy. Nothing unusual about that. They emigrated to Canada. The family changed the spelling of their name when they got to Canada from spelling McCluskey with an O to McCluskey with a U. And they also, strangely, changed the spelling of the name Kerr and Gillen to Carr and Gillen with an E, respectively, in their children's middle names. And this appears to be quite a common practice among immigrants to North America. But usually it's seen among particularly German immigrants, where they changed their name because people found it hard to pronounce the German surnames. But why people from Ireland with relatively simple surnames would change their name when they went to the New World, I am not sure. Maybe some of our North American friends who are with us tonight could have some theories on that. I just included that because it was interesting that they changed all these names. So I'm going to move forward in time now and look to. I'm not going to say too much about Thomas Kerr because I don't know too much. We don't actually know too much about Thomas Kerr. But we're going to talk about his oldest son, James Kerr, a little bit now, who is the direct ancestor of a lot of us here tonight. He's my great-grandfather. But when he was courting Sarah Kirkpatrick, he walked to see her from Clentyfinnan to Moyarget, and that's quite a distance. It's about 6 miles away, so a 12-mile round trip. He'd walk that because he didn't ride a bicycle. After his day's work on the farm, you needn't be thinking he got on a motorbike either, because this motorbike, as you see when you get the book, was a motorbike that was bought for their oldest daughter Margaret when she started a teaching job, to get to the teaching job, and this was about, I think, about 1920. Like many Presbyterians of Scottish descent, and this was true in Scotland up until about 50 years ago, we didn't celebrate Christmas. Christmas wasn't a big thing in Scotland, but James would go out and work in the fields on Christmas Day. This was to show his neighbours that to him it was just a regular day and he didn't celebrate Christmas. But Sarah, his wife, described her husband James as being a person who was always in a hurry to get somewhere, and equally always in a hurry to get home. And sometimes I feel a bit like that, so maybe I've inherited that. Anyway, we'll talk a little bit about the purchase of Carisbrooke and Springfield. As we said, they were tenant farmers. So they, in Ireland, in Northern Ireland, there was more security of tenure than there would have been in other parts of Ireland. Farms could be passed down from father to son, even though they were tenants. That was less so in the rest of Ireland, but things were a bit more flexible in Ulster. But anyway, there were various land acts, Irish land acts through the years, and the one in 1903 gave the right to buy land, I think when someone had died and was in their estate. So about 1918, there was the tenant farmers of Finnan, and they're all listed here, and you can see Robert Kerr is listed here, and James Kerr. So Robert Kerr's is Springfield, the Carisbrooke Kerrs. They bought their land from the estate of the former landowner, Margaret Adams McConnell, who was James Adams' daughter, who was the landlord after James Adams. So the Finnan tenants received an advance from the government, and this had to go through an act of parliament, or had to be passed in parliament, hence Irish Land Act, return of advances under that. So this is was published where it's said there, and basically they got a loan or mortgage, which was paid back to be paid back over 25 years, and James paid the equivalent of £267, and that's about, in 2020, that's about £16,000 for his 23-acre Springfield farm. I don't know if you can see here, but Robert paid for the Carisbrooke farm, which by this stage was almost 100 acres, because he inherited some, or he acquired some land from one of the other Kerrs who had died. So it was quite a big farm by that stage. He paid about £1,000. So now we come on to a detective story. Tom Kerr. Tom Kerr was James's younger brother, and all we knew about him, he was my second great uncle, so great uncle, and all we knew about him was he had a shop in Belfast, he was married twice, had no children, and he was said to be a bit too fond of the drink, or had a fondness for drink, one of the other. So our first clue was from the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland's will calendar site, where it sort of lists various information about wills that are stored on record. And we found this record of a Thomas Kerr. We weren't sure whether it was him or not. When he died, the administration of his estate was granted to James Kerr, farmer. Didn't say where this James Kerr lived. Was this Tom Kerr? We didn't know. The occupation of commission agent didn't seem to fit, because he was, as far as we were concerned, he had a shop. I then discovered the grave of this person. It was on, there's this website called Find a Grave. There's another one called Billion Graves, where, people take photographs of graves and they upload them, and people can, like me, can look at them and use it to trace their ancestors. So this was the grave of this Thomas Kerr. No indication that it was our Tom Kerr, but it did mention a spouse who was also buried in the same gravesite, Jane Woodside Kerr. Then came the breakthrough. The General Record Office of Northern Ireland Records became available online in 2013, and in 2015 I found the death record of Thomas Kerr, who died in 1914, and it was the person, as we'll see, it was our man. So this is a transcription of that record, and the key thing is James Kerr, the brother, the person causing the body to be buried in his residence, County Finnan, Ballymoney. So this was, without doubt, the Tom Kerr, who I'm going to see here, he's listed as a tea merchant. He died of a cerebral hemorrhage with no medical attention. Suggests he may have fallen over and banged his head. So once with that verified, it enables us to search the British newspaper archive, and we came across a record of his both of his marriages. His first marriage was to somebody called S.E. Jane Ray, however, she sadly died a year later, slightly over a year later, of TB. I see his record of his marriage and his death here. This is in the book. A few years later, he then married Jane Woodside, who's the one who's buried in the same gravesite as him. But she died 14 years later of a tumour of the brain. Very sad. Records show that Tom Kerr started his own grocery business, and originally it was 11 Dublin Road in Belfast. And the 1910 Street Directory in Belfast records him as a tea merchant and agent at 32 Ann Street. And there's various adverts you can find in the the newspaper sites of his business was clearly doing well. Wanted in 1882 an apprentice, and a few months later wanted 2 apprentices. Whether that's because the first apprentice wasn't up to the job, I don't know. But and then 1902, you see, wanted a stout lad to drive van. I assume that's a horse-drawn van. Obviously, the business was doing well. He was taking on employees. Mm-hmm. Although his business prospered, as we've seen, Tom's personal life, there's a lot of tragedy, with both wives dying very young. And we speculate, we don't know, but these untimely deaths may have contributed to his drinking habits. And his fondness for drink may be related to his unattended death at Pottinger's Entry. And this is Pottinger's Entry at the present day. And you've got my aunt, Margaret Kerr, here at Pottinger's Entry a couple of years ago. So it's a little alleyway. I've, not to my knowledge, I've never been at it, but this is where Tom Kerr met his end. And then we can speculate. I've written an apocryphal ending to this, so it may be true, some of it may be true, some of it may not be true. So in the years after his second wife's death, Tom cut an increasingly depressed figure and frequently drank far too much. After one of his by now regular midweek drinking sessions, the 29th of February 2014, when he was found dead, was a Tuesday, Tom staggered back to his flat above the shop in Ann Street, and on the way, he slipped and fell on some wet leaves in Pottinger's Entry and banged his head. Unconscious, severely injured, he was found dead the next morning. Maybe even by one of his, assistants in the shop. Who knows? It's an apocryphal end to the story that I wrote. But look at another, the youngest brother in the family now, Hugh Kerr. And there's an interesting tale with Hugh as well. Now, Hugh moved to Belfast, didn't become a farmer, went to Belfast like his brother, and was a carpenter in the Harland Wolff shipyard. He married Minnie McClooney from Ballymena, and they lived at 6 Penrose Street in Belfast. And this is 6 Penrose Street, the present day, taken from Street View. Now, they and their eldest 3 children emigrated to Camden, New Jersey, where he got a job as a similar job in the Camden shipyards as a carpenter. His American descendants have related the story, and I've heard this in several branches of the family in America, that Hugh emigrated to America because of pressure from when he worked at the shipyards to join the Orange Order. And this is the man himself. He was told that he would be promoted to foreman, but first he had to join the Orange Order, but he refused. And he said that he saw no reason to hate Catholics, and he wasn't going to join the Orange Order, and he was fired on the spot. So after that, he worked for a few months in Liverpool in the shipyards, then sailed from Liverpool to Camden, and his wife and children joined him a couple of months later. And a little bit about Elizabeth Kerr, Thomas's daughter. James is the oldest in the family. She had an illegitimate son in 1875. His name was Samuel Kerr. Somewhat unusually, if you used to looking at these records, the father was named. Usually the father's name section is blank. But it wasn't blank. His name was John McCook, and he was from a neighbouring farm. You can always tell on these records because the child is illegitimate, because there's usually no name in there, and formerly where they put the maiden name is stroked out. Samuel was said to have emigrated to Winnipeg. He's not in the 1901 census. I should say that this is Elizabeth Kerr here. He's not in the 1901 census, and there the trail goes cold. I can't find any record of him in Winnipeg or Canada or anywhere in the US. He may have descendants somewhere, and someday they might show up. Probably I will detect them, if I do detect them, using DNA, but as yet that's an unsolved mystery. Elizabeth married Samuel Hume, Nookham Avery, Mr. Nookham, in 1881. And Elizabeth sadly died at quite a young age, 51, of breast cancer, effectively, in February 1901. However, we came upon another little bit of a mystery here. There's no mention of her husband in the 1901 census, and their eldest son was listed as head of the household. We thought originally he'd emigrated or he was dead, he just left the family. But he wasn't dead, because on Elizabeth's death record, she's still listed as married. If he'd been dead, she would have been listed as a widow. So where was he? So after reading some things online, I began to wonder, was he in prison or an asylum? Because those are the only 2 reasons why somebody wouldn't be on the census. Anyway, eventually, after a lot of looking, I found him in the 1911 census, and he was a patient in Antrim Asylum. Asylum patients in the censuses or the censi were listed by their initials. Samuel's age and his initials here, SH. His age is right, where he was from, and he'd been there since September 1900, and this is how long he was here for, 10 years, 7 months. But 1901 census, this was just, he was admitted 5 months just before his wife's death. So you can get some information on this. I submitted a Freedom of Information request because he's been, he died in 1917, so it's over 100 years since his death, so we can get some information. And they sent didn't send very much information. They sent a few pages about his committal and recommittal. His recommittal was 2 weeks after his wife's death. So he was originally admitted in September 1900, and he'd previously been having episodes of hallucination and wandering away from home. And this is a picture of the asylum here. He was discharged from hospital, probably on compassionate grounds following his wife's death, but unfortunately he appears to have relapsed and was readmitted on the 27th of February. And sadly, he was never, at our knowledge, he never got out again. He died there of a heart attack in 1817. Then we come on to just finish up on a few Kerrs who lived in County Finnan, but we can't make the connection to our families. It's headstone in Bushvale Churchyard reads like this. Samuel talks about Samuel Kerr, and he's the Samuel Kerr who was on the coloured map earlier. He had a son called Hugh Kerr, who died in 1902. As I say, the relationship between this family and the James and Robert Kerr family is unclear, but they may well be related through a pre-1750 common ancestor. Now, Samuel and Nancy had 10 known children. 8 of these children emigrated to the US. Of the children, only 2, Nancy, who died and is also buried in Bushvale, and Hugh didn't emigrate. But Hugh Kerr's youngest son left quite an extensive will, and his will, not many wills are available in the public record of us in Northern Ireland, but his is, and in his will, it mentions all these names. So that's enabled me to trace, and this is at the back of the book, a short section at the back of the book, just for completeness, because they lived at County Finnan. Enables me to trace some of the ancestors of Samuel Kerr and the relatives of Hugh Kerr using this information. But one of the most interesting people who we came across in this line is Alexander Hewitt Kerr. And he was Hugh Kerr's nephew, and he originally started a grocery business with a couple of his brothers. And in 1903, he founded the Kerr Canning Jar Manufacturing Company. This is an advert for some of these Kerr jars. So they made these Kerr jars, and they were used, and they still are used, for bottling fruit, and made these what we call Kerr economy jars. And these wide-mouthed jars revolutionized home canning, which is a big thing in the US, and I'm sure in Canada as well. And still in universal use today, these Kerr jars. And Dorothy has sent me a Kerr jar. I don't know if you can see that. I drink water out of it. So they used to have a drink sometimes out of a Kerr jar. So became quite wealthy. And then we've got the John Kerr from County Finnan, married Anne Guthrie, and we got a couple of the descendants of this family here tonight with us. They moved to Nova Scotia, and again, we don't know how they are related. They lived in County Finnan. They moved from County Finnan in 1816, but we don't know how they are related to our branch of the Kerrs. So we don't know, but it's just included in the book. And there's a few DNA insights. Liz Farquhar, Nee Kerr, the last surviving Kerrsbrook Kerr, who's my 4th cousin, once removed. So we share this common Kerr ancestor going back to about mid-1700s. We match over 40 unit of genetic measurements, centimorgans on DNA. So that's good that we match. We've already mentioned William Kerr, this Y-DNA connection, way back. John Kerr of Gower, we mentioned that one as well. There's also the Ballyweeny Kerrs. I'm not sure if we were due to be joined by a descendant of the Ballyweeny Kerrs tonight, but I'm not sure if Dafa, if that's how you pronounce his name, is here tonight or not. But one of the Ballyweeny Kerrs descendants, lives in the US now, is a DNA match with Liz Farquhar. So it seemed to indicate that the Ballyweeny Kerrs are way back related as well. But that's a work in progress, because family history is never finished. And then there's a group of Kerrs at the Sconce, if that's how you say it, near Articlave, near Castle Rock. And there's an old family story. They're also related to the County Finnan Kerrs, and indeed the Garba Kerrs as well. And my father is actually a DNA match with one of the Sconce Kerrs. I'm not, but things can change quickly with DNA over generations. So it seemed to confirm that story. So just to finish up, there's a few outstanding questions, because as I say, it's never finished. Samuel Kerr, illegitimate son of Elizabeth Kerr, where did he go to? I can't find him. Who was the first Kerr to reside at County Finnan? When was this? We may never find out, but it it's there as a question. How are the Clinty Finn and Kerrs related to the John Kerr who emigrated to Nova Scotia, and the siblings of Hugh Kerr who emigrated to the US? We don't know. When did the Clinty Finn and Kerrs and the Ballywinnie Kerrs and other Kerrs in the Northampton area, when were they all part of an original group of Kerrs? When did they diverge? Where does the William Kerr, where does his ancestors fit into that picture as well? And can we make the connection? This is one thing I would really like to do, is to make the connection between the early 1700s, between this deed of record, between this James Kerr's grave in 1735 and some of the earliest records that we can go back to, which is of 1800. I'd love to make the connection between those two. And something may show up at some point in that regard. So, as many will be aware, the book is now in print, and I have one here. A box arrived the other day, and thankfully they did arrive with me intact. I know some boxes have not arrived in good shape at all, so with some distribution problems, but mine arrived in good shape, which was good. So in addition to the historical data, a lot of which, some of which we presented tonight, there's many more up-to-date stories and memories from each of the branches of the wider family, and they help to add, life and photographs and context to the book. So it's much more than than data and genealogical information. There's a social history in there as well, of the last 100 years and even before that, and you can get a real appreciation for what it was like to live both in Northampton and indeed wider afield, in days gone by. So this is the cover, and I'd like to thank everybody for all your help in the research and compilation of the book. I'm sure Dorothy would like to thank people as well. So how do you get hold of a copy if you haven't already? I think some of you have already. The cost is $30 US or 25 pounds. Those in North America should contact Dorothy. For those in Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, a supply of books, if they haven't been mauled by the USPS or thrown in a river or played football with, whatever they've done with them, they'll be available from various family members who've been distributed to. I've got a supply, as I said. I can also mail them to people. I've already emailed a couple, one to Germany and one to Dublin. So I've got a few, so I can mail some to people. Okay, so that is me finished. I've ran on. Oh, it's been about an hour. It's not too bad. Obviously, you should lecture more than 40 minutes, but sometimes I let get the better of me. So we'll stop sharing now. Okay, so yes, I see a question there. Somebody will access the recording later. If somebody wants the recording, I'm recording it for Liz Farquhar. So I will. If you send me an email, I can send you a link to the recording. Yes. Okay, so people can probably unmute themselves, provided they're not everybody wants to speak at once, or if people do want to speak.
Andrew, can I say something?
Oh yes, John. Hello.
Okay, how are you? Very informative, very interesting talk. On page 12 of the book, you mentioned the original Kerr ancestor that came from Garva, Bernard Kerr.
Yes.
That was very interesting because he was born in 1732, and
right.
His initials and the date 1732 were on the stone above the door of a very old house that was just straight across from the gates of Garva House, where the Cannings lived when they came over here during the plantation. And that house was demolished in 1979. And my father, who was working at that time in the health centre just across the road, we owned that house, got that stone back. And when I built my house the following year, 1980, I've got that stone above my back door.
All right.
BK 1732. I could show you a photograph of it now, but it's a bit dark. So just an interesting little link with history.
Indeed, yes.
Yeah.
Very good.
I'm pleased you could join us tonight.
Yeah, very good, Andrew. Very good. We've never met, but that was
No, we never have.
Yeah. You can come over now when you're finished this project and research the Garva branch.
I've been booked by one of the Ballyweenie Kerrs to do the same.
Oh, have you? Right.